I don't really know much about wellbeing measurement, probably no more than most people, or probably about the same as most people in this room. I'm a qualitative researcher who's done a lot of grounded work in communities, including communities that experience disadvantage. And I work in the public health field, but not daunted by the fact that I'm not an expert on measurement. I'm going to give you some of my thoughts on making a difference to wellbeing inequalities, particularly focusing on the measurement. And really what my key message will be is, even if we get the metrics right, and we've heard a lot about the different metrics and measuring it at population level, we might miss some very important things that would make a difference to action. So I'm going to ask 3 questions, which hopefully might set up as well for the panel discussion and the workshops. My first question is, should we be focusing on variations or inequalities in wellbeing? And what do I mean by that? Well, variations are when we start studying the differences between population groups, between countries, between areas. A lot of wellbeing science does that. But inequalities goes further than that. And I think we perhaps need to draw some lessons from the vast body of knowledge in public health research around health inequalities. Here, there has been a move from looking at the epidemiology of mortality and morbidity, simply the variations in population group, to understanding what are the avoidable and often systemic differences that are caused by social and economic factors, the determinants of health. And I'm sure you all in this audience will know and have heard about those determinants of health. And I am suggesting that maybe in wellbeing, if we're going to think about wellbeing inequalities, and Marmot Review, that very famous strategic review of health inequalities, referred to these, we need to be concentrating our research firepower, if you like, on understanding what are those avoidable differences that are unfair and unjust. And if we take that health equity or that social justice lens, it will make us avoid focusing entirely on individual pathology, which I think sometimes some of the, I'm not accusing anyone here today of this, but sometimes some of the language around well-being and happiness and so on, it feels a very individually constructed thing. And Lynn Friedley has offered very powerful critique around well-being and assets and so on over a number of years. But in this report she did for the WHO, she points out, I think, something quite profound around our understanding being less around individual pathology and more as a response to relative deprivation and social injustice, which erode, and I love this phrase, erode the emotional, spiritual and intellectual resources essential to well-being. So if we take an inequalities approach, we really are focusing on what are those determinants of well-being. And in my experience in working in the public health field, in local government and in the voluntary and community sector are very well aware of those determinants and make, good efforts, I think, to try and measure them. And that's reflected in the systematic scoping review of indicators that we did in our programme that my colleague Anne-Marie talked about. And if you look at some of the most high-frequency domains that came out of that, you'll see a reflection, again, of those determinants. And what I'm suggesting is that we should keep that inequalities, that equity lens when we're looking at well-being, and not just talk about variations. You may disagree with me later. The second question I want to ask, have we got enough social in the science of well-being? Now, I'm going to put up a quote that goes back to the 17th century. It's a very well-used quote, and I apologise because the language isn't quite, it's no human is an island entire of itself. Every human is a piece of the continent and a part of the main. It's something that speaks to a lot of the work around well-being. We do understand, as Rhiannon said, there is a we-ness as well as an I-ness. But I know from my work in research or in communities, we have not got the science, the metrics of measuring community level change and community level outcomes well enough. We're still at the point of measuring individuals and aggregating it up in order to understand what's happening at community level. And this has been the essence of our community wellbeing programme, struggling, as Anne-Marie said, with some of the challenges and complexities of that. And many of the things we need to measure are things around the social environment that people live in, because the relationship between that social environment and their own personal well-being is related. So we put this metric around people, place and power. Again, that is not particularly new. It draws on literature about the importance of social connections, about the importance of the built and physical environment around people, their housing, and the importance of power and the sense of control that people have. But I think we need to be bringing this together into more integrated frameworks. And I want to share just two with you very briefly. I'm not suggesting these could necessarily be wellbeing frameworks, but examples of the way of bringing those things together to understand well-being. So first, this is an outcome, I won't call it really a framework, but it's a way of thinking about outcomes that arise from community-centred approaches in the public health field. And here, this work I've done with Public Health England, we are drawing on the Institute of Medicine from the States. They've got an integrated framework for assessing the value of community-based prevention, and we've sort of embellished it a bit, I suppose, you could say. But really, the central idea being that we've got some individual measures, including well-being, quality of life and so on, health status, personal development. We've got an attempt to measure at a community level, so the things that happen in communities, changes to the physical and social environment, community resources or assets, social capital. And then also community processes, representation, advocacy, civil engagement, volunteering. These are all important aspects of community wellbeing, how people engage with things in what we call, I think, citizenship, the domains of citizenship. Another example is of a European project. Sorry, that's knocked off. I don't know why the slides are not quite right, are they? Some of the stuff's being knocked off, but never mind. But it's an active citizenship composite indicator which is developed in the as a cross-European project in 2009. And again, it's not about well-being, it's about active citizenship. But I think you can see many of the components that you might have in a sort of well-being framework to look at that social dimension. And it's particularly interesting, we might debate, because Richard sort of mentioned about UEA, whether countries that are not democracies really, how well-being sits in that when people don't have the right to determine their governments. And finally, my third question is, whose evidence is it? And I think we do, when we're talking about well-being inequalities, we do have to think about the politics of evidence. Who makes evidence? Who, for what purpose do they do it? How do they use evidence? And who else? And who has access to it? Who does it represent? And in our community evidence programme, Anne-Marie mentioned, we've held 2 deliberative or public hearings where we've debated evidence, and particularly at the first hearing, our mixed audience, people from the voluntary sector, local government, the NHS, policymakers and academics, did actually talk a lot about the nature of evidence. And I'm going to share with you 2 quotes from that hearing, which I think illustrates some of the issues around measurement. The first one comes from somebody working in the voluntary sector. Your softer outcomes may be my hard outcomes. Your hard outcomes, I don't give a monkey's about. So the thing about feeling wanted, the feeling you might have a sense of belonging, the sense of making a real friend today, which you would describe as softer outcomes, they're actually my euphoria. And I think it's that difference between how people might see evidence here, not about well-being, how people might see evidence on well-being that's important. And a second quote a person talking about the need to have a more nuanced idea of evidence. We need a balance between conversations and spreadsheets, between stories and statistics. So, just to really conclude, there's a lot that needs to be done around measurement of well-being and measurement of inequalities. And it's fantastic, as people have mentioned in the UK, that how much things have advanced in that science and also through the What Works Centre. But my conclusion is, whatever the metrics, don't miss a focus on the determinants of avoidable differences, because they will give people out in practice the levers to make the change and make the difference. Let's try and work on the intellectual challenge and practical challenge of measurement at a community level, thinking about things like social relationships, social connectedness and citizenship. And if we are going to think about inequalities, we must include lay perspectives on well-being from the people who are most compromised, whose well-being is most compromised by the conditions and circumstances in which they find they have to live their lives. And really, please, hopefully these will be points for discussion. I've tried to be a bit provocative about things, but I think there's lots that we can debate together. Thank you.